Hi everyone, welcome to this drafting analysis on two Giles James coats. I always do this introduction after I've actually done the main part, so I know what I'm talking about. And as I was doing it, one of the coats reminded me of this. So if you're looking for an easier way to create the piping of one of the coats, you could just add a different highlight or even just a ribbon made out of the same fabric. Whatever you do, I do hope you enjoy this drafting and tutorial on the pink Gothic coat and the 1930s tartan coat. Before I look at the two Giles James styles in detail, I just want to quickly show you what I did on the Instagram live drafting analysis last week, and I put a link in the description. And if you're interested, I can upload it to here, but it is sort of, it's the wrong format and everything. So I think if you keep it separate, it's probably a bit cleaner. And because it's live, it's sort of quite chatty and not as coherent as I try to be normally. But I did a quick pattern. So if you're trying to make that green coat, it is a starting point. But now let's have a look at two more really nice Giles James coats, and they are the Gothic coat, which I really love, and it has that real Regency feel. But actually, well, this Giles James, there is a massive disclaimer, because I think it'd be very difficult to actually copy Giles James. Just because it's couture, so he draped everything. There's lots of under workings going on, and in that book, Secret Shapes of Couture, they sort of go into a whole thing, all the padding, the layers, to make it stand away. So it's probably really hard to copy it exactly, but we can use lots of details to make our own version or pick the details we like. So on this one, for example, I really like how the collar is separate. So it's a separate panel. So I think it looks very much sort of Regency, where you used to have like your your Empire line dresses, and when they used to often wear these really cropped little jackets on top, women. And I find it reminds me of that. But the way it works, so you've got your neckline, and can you see, because it's a separate panel, it doesn't actually go to the center front. So our collar looks like this, and then it sort of turns round and it goes into the side seam, and then it sort of goes up, and it's really nice big collar, and this is from the Met website. So if you look, it's called the Gothic one. So if you look on the Met archive, there are a few more views. And actually I've drawn a little bit too small, because can you see it goes to the shoulder. But the sleeves, I think, a bit inset. So I moved the, I'll show you in a big one. I think the sleeve, if you look at it, I think it's more like this. So it nearly becomes a raglan sleeve, and you can use the raglan sleeve method, but I would just, for something like that, I would just sort of shave it off, and then you add that part to your sleeve. So it's like the basic raglan sleeve, really quick to make. So that's one detail you can use, that really nice inset sleeve. The other method is, of course, that you maybe, if you make a dress or a shirt, to have that sort of little separate panel, which I think is quite nice. And then underneath, he's just got sort of like a V-neck, but it's slightly curved, so it hasn't got an angle, which I think quite like. And then it's got two buttons, and I think the buttons are actually not above each other. So I think one is more like this and one is more like that. So but it could just be the angle, but it looks like they're slightly different. And this panel is basically stitched to the actual coat to here, and then it becomes loose and it has a facing. And I would imagine the facing properly goes like this. So I'm going to show you in a second. It's basically the undercoat is this shape, then the top layer is that shape, and then you also got facing. So you got 3 layers and they're all held together here and here. Then I think I should have gotten a back view. I think this looks like it's a seam there, but in theory you could actually cut the whole coat, or it could be actually a really cute little A-line top, which I know isn't always the best if you're bigger busted, but it could be a really nice style. Or it could be a dress. So if you made it out of floaty fabric, it'd be less sculptural, maybe slightly less historical, and more really nice summer dress. And I would actually then just make, maybe even just have a keyhole here and just have a really simple front. I'm going to draw it to you in a second. But what's interesting, can you see there's a seam? Is there a dart? It might be, I think there's actually a dart line here, but Charles James quite often did very, because it's draped, it does stuff which works for the style, and that's why it looks so couture. But if you made it for yourself, you would actually think you could have really subtle dart, which would make the shape more rounded rather than pure A-lines. So it does, you know, it could be really nice. But then it just looks like, I'm going to draw the sleeves first, and the sleeves are sort of curved, and that's a typical Charles James. They sort of curve forward. But then he spent 3 years perfecting his sleeves. And then it's a 2-piece sleeve, because you can see one seam there. And then he's also got a sort of seam which seems to come from the back. I don't think it's at the... I'm going to try to get an image from the back, because I wonder whether it's actually... because there seems to be a seam here, right on top. And I wonder if the back has a different armhole, which would explain why you've got a top seam as well, because maybe the back is a raglan or a 1-piece. So I try to get an image for you if I can. But you can see it's just quite a long, and then it's got little, I think they're just inset pockets, so they're literally they might have a very narrow welt. Have a look of it. And I wasn't 100% sure that there's a seam down here, but I think that's just lines rather than seams. So you got the pocket just inset like that. So if I quickly just with the 3 panels, the way I would make it is that you're under your full coat. Let's move that out of the way for a second. So the undercoat looks like, I'm going to draw this side. And then it goes to here, and then it's got a V-neck. So it's got that sort of V shape, and then that's our shoulder line. But then it goes like this. So it's like that. And then this part is separate. So that could be already made out of lining fabric. Because when you stitch this part, and in the same seam, you also stitch the facing here. So on top of it, so you also got the facing, which looks like this. and that's stitched into here. And when that's facing along the outside line and here, it also attaches to the top, which is just like this. So it's to get that sort of cutout shape where everything is put together. So it's really neat. So it looks like it's something worn on top, but that's just a seam. So really neat. And then there you snip into your fabric and you swap what's stitched together. And this is the other joining seam where everything comes together. So this is the Gothic coat, which I think is a really famous Charles James style. But the second one I want to show you, I think, I'm quickly gonna do one more thing. I quickly just want to show you how I think it would make a really nice dress, really simple. So if you wanted to make a dress like that, I would just do exactly the same. Oh, it's gonna be a bad drawing. So you've got your top thing, but then you could, for the skirt, so you could have it with sort of quite nice sleeves. You could sort of maybe have a look at some more Regency things and play around with that, because I quite often had really nice sleeves as well. And then the under part, you could either have like that, or if you don't want to have a side seam, as for instance the front seam, you could either have a little keyhole, or if you make it big enough you don't need anything, or you could even have some gathers or something. It's up to you, but it's basically, you can just use that sort of overcoat style and add it to lots of different styles. So let's have a look at the other one, which I think is quite clever because it's a really variable coat. It's a really classic overcoat. It's far less of a statement than either the pink or the green one, but it's very clever. And did I have the back as well? I'm gonna put an image of the back for you, because it sort of goes, this sneaks onto the bodice. But what's really clever is that what makes it special is that it's cut on bias, and that's why it drapes so beautifully. So because it's cut on bias, I don't think there's actually any shaping in this coat. So it's a very soft wool, and I think a lot of the fit, I think it might be, no, but it's none, because you can really tell from the tartan check that there's no shaping. So all the shaping is done through side seams, and because it's a soft drapey fabric cut on bias. And if you've worked on bias before, you know with stuff like that, what it gets really tricky is the hem and the lining and everything matching up, because everything is going to stretch slightly differently. And there's a really good, if you know Fashion Half Cut, the podcast, they've done a episode on bias, and it's really interesting and accessible, because Caroline talks quite a lot about all this sort of stuff, because quite often if you make bias dresses it doesn't really matter as much, but if you do something like that that's just lined and it drapes differently, what you actually do is you cut it all raw, and then you let it hang for a few days, and then you actually draw in your balanced hem level. So it's sort of stuff like that. And even for the sleeve you might have to do the same thing. But the overall construction is really easy. It's a shawl collar with points, and again it's a really big shawl collar, so it touches the shoulders. In this case the shoulders are really simple, and again this is a Charles James warning. He's got these really nice 3D shapes which looks like they're padded panels. So again you could, because because it's cut on bias, he would have all done it by hand. And it's probably what happened is, without being cynical, I think he probably cut the coat and it was too loose because it's cut on bias. So he actually used it to his advantage and started pinching out things. And that just sort of gives you a really nice detail. But if you were doing it on purpose, have a look at the whole coat, because what basically happens, you have this detail, and then if that's your side seam, so that's your sleeve, your side view, and that's your front, and this is your back, this detail, so that channels snakes onto the back, and I'm putting an image in the description. And then on the back, which is actually more special on this coat, the pinched out bit snakes around it. So it's basically like piping which has been worked out of the existing pattern. So it's very clever. If you wanted to copy the exact style, what I would do is, and actually sorry, the same sort of padded piping look also happens along the front, and I think they've just done just a few layers of, could be like a nice fluffy wool, sort of a felt, semi-felted fabric, and that could just be cut into strips and then it's just top stitched for that look. So if you want to do that, I would make a sample and think, basically if you cut your collar like normal and you want to add that 3D effect, do you need to make it a bit bigger? Because if you make it 3D, so if it looks like this, you might have to add a bit on the top collar or on both, because realistically it's going to be evenly distributed. So you might have to make it a little bit bigger to compensate for it becoming 3D. And the same with your sleeve. What I would do is, so if you start with a sleeve, I would draw on the line you want to cut, and you want to keep it as straight as possible because it'll be easier to make it. And then you basically, you might want to take that out of the ease as well, but you basically match your back to it. So my sleeve, I think, has very little ease, but you need to make sure it's matching where it will actually sit. And then you draw the line, I think it goes something like, it might go all the way down, I have to look it up. And then you cut it along this line and you open it up by just that bit. And that will become, let's have a look where this actually seam. I will make it as a seam. In theory, you can just make it that bigger, and then you can hand stitch it into curved channel. It's quite tricky, so it's easier if you have a seam. So you add like 1 centimeter either side and you have a seam, and then you pad it out again and becomes your panel. But I think what I would do is say, I think with two nice details which are worth copying is that it's cut on bias, so it sits beautifully, and we in Westwood used the same sort of effect. But if you have a classic wool coat, but instead of it being cut on the straight, you cut it on bias, it suddenly becomes a lot more feminine. It becomes a lot more organic. It sort of follows your shape. So that's one detail I think would be really nice to copy from this. And the other detail would be is that sort of padded edging to the collar and padded edging to the seam. And you don't need to take it all the way. If you do want to really create that look, I would make a trowel out of a cheap soft wool fabric and then see how much you actually need to add, because it's on bias. You might just actually get away with just cutting the whole back a little bit too big and pinching it out because it's on bias, or you cut your flat pattern like this with the extra sort of, depending how you want it big, you want it to be about an inch, 2 to 3 centimeter added, and then you really need to trowel and see how it actually wants to flow, where it wants to be pinched out. So these are the 2 Giles James styles. A lot of you liked, and I hope you enjoyed this drafting tutorial, and I will see you next week with a series on Violet, which will also cover quite a lot of bias like this style. But that's it for me for today. Bye!